A moment for the fabric. A moment for the fabric. Yo, me not gonna lie. When McCalls first dropped M8413, I totally slept on that pattern. But your girl had a change of mind. So grab a drink and join me for today's video. Hey Stitchers, your girl Kris here. Welcome or welcome back to my channel Unsewcial, where it's totally cool to be obsessed with sewing. So for today's video, I'll be sharing with you a sew with me featuring McCalls 8413. Now, when this pattern was first released, I totally slept on this pattern, you guys. I was not intrigued by it at all. But I recently shared with you my sewing plans featuring this gorgeous fabric from Minerva. Can we have a moment for the fabric? And I could not help but envision this fabric in this pattern. So I quickly ran over to the Simplicity website, and fortunately for me, the pattern was on sale for $4.99. I whipped it up, printed it out, and it got sewing this pattern. And I decided to film a sew with me video featuring this pattern because I feel like lots of you have also fell asleep on this pattern. I searched it in the Instagram hashtags and it came up blank. So I'm hoping that by the end of today's video, I will have inspired you to give this pattern a go. So let's get started. All right, so I am assembling my pattern. I only have this pattern, which is McCalls 8413 in the PDF style of the pattern. I don't have the printed envelope. And so I have to go ahead and stick my pattern pieces together. Now, this pattern is a fairly simple pattern. There are only 3 pattern pieces: your back bodice, your front bodice, and the drawstring tie pieces. Now, I feel like this pattern is going to come together relatively easy. I think the most difficult part is probably going to be putting in the buttonholes, and that's only if you are a beginner. You might just have a little hesitation about putting in the buttonholes. But aside from that, I'm thinking that this pattern should come together fairly quickly and fairly hassle-free. So I think I'm going to cut out the size 18 blended to a size 20 in this pattern. So it's going to be an 18 at the neckline and the shoulders, blended out to a 20 at the bust line, the waist, and the hips. All right, folks, to sew up this pattern, you're going to need the 3 pattern pieces. So you need pattern piece number 1, which is this piece right here, and you need to cut 2 of pattern piece number 1. You're also going to need to cut pattern piece number 2, and you're going to cut 2 of pattern piece number 2. And then finally, you also need pattern piece number 3, which are the ties, and you need to cut 2 of pattern piece number 3. Now I've already gone ahead and removed my pattern piece number 1 from my paper pattern, and I have followed the instructions, which have you stay stitch right along your bodice front until you get down to the notches. Now I've also gone ahead and put interfacing just right behind the marking for the buttonhole right here. And so for my next step, I'm going to go ahead and put in my buttonholes. I've gone ahead and put my buttonhole in. This is what it looks like. And before I open her, I do like to use some fray check. Looks like this. If you're interested in this, I have it linked in my Amazon store, and I'll put the link, in the description box down below. So I'm just going to add a little fray check to my buttonhole front opening, and then I'm going to flip it over on the back side and add a little bit more fray check. As you can see at my back, I didn't quite place my interfacing correctly, so it's just a little bit above my buttonhole, but I don't think it has impacted the buttonhole too much. But I would implore you just to double check where your buttonhole is before you go ahead and attach your interfacing. So I'm going to leave that on for a bit so that it can set before I open up my buttonhole. So the next step is to take your front bodice piece to your sewing machine and run a line of ease stitching right from below your notch, where you stopped your stay stitching right here, right the way around the perimeter of your front bodice piece, right the way to the side seam. So I'm going to head to my machine now and put in my ease stitching lines. Now, just in case you're not sure, your ease stitch needs to be the longest stitch on your machine. So I have run my ease stitching right along the perimeter of my bodice front, and my machine has the longest length of 6. So I went ahead and used 6 millimeter stitch length for my ease stitching. Now once you have completed your ease stitching, the next step is to join your bodice fronts together. So to do this, we're going to pin along the center front, and I'm just going to place a pin right here at the top, but we're not going to commence stitching here. We're actually going to commence stitching just below the notch that we had put in earlier, just where we had stopped our stitching. Now you should have gone ahead and put a second notch towards the hemline of your skirt. There is a notch closer to the hemline, and you should have put it in. We want to go ahead now and match up your bodice pieces at that second notch. Now let me see if I can find where I put my marking. It would be just below your buttonhole. So I found my 2 buttonholes right here, and I did go ahead and put this blue dot, which helps me to find where my notch is right here. So I have my 2 notches in place. I'm just going to put a pin right at the edge of my fabric. Now this is a viscose rayon fabric, which means that if you're not careful with your pinning, you run the risk of snagging your fabric and putting reams in your fabric, and I don't want that. So I'm going to take my time and put pins right along my center front. Then I'll take it to my sewing machine and stitch at a 7/8 of an inch seam allowance. So we have joined our front bodice pieces together, and we can move our front pieces out of the way and then grab our back pieces. And the first step is going to be to stay stitched along your back neckline edge at a 1/2 an inch seam allowance. Our back pieces have been stay stitched, and it's now time to join our front bodice to our back bodice pieces at the shoulder line. Alright, so I've gone ahead and sewn my shoulder seams together using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now the instructions don't tell you, but you're going to want to go ahead and finish off your seam allowances. Now I'm going to use my serger to finish off my seams, but before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and pin together my front and back at the side seams, stitch it using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then I can finish off my side seams and my shoulder seams in one go. Alright, so the instructions tell you to press under your center front seam allowances by a 1/4 inch. I did go ahead and finish the edges of my fabric even though the instructions don't tell you to do this part, for 2 reasons. One, I'm working with a viscose rayon and it will fray itself away even under the edges that you can't see, like when it's laundered and over time. So I wanted to help prevent that. And second, I find it so much easier to turn under the 1/4 inch from the seam allowance when your edges have been serged. I feel like the serging thread just gives a little bit more stability and helps turning under the seam allowances so much easier. That being said, my seams are not 100% accurate, and I only realized this when I was turning this under. I'm hoping it's not going to be such a big deal because, of course, there's going to be a tie in the front casing which will gather the fabric together, and hopefully it won't be so obvious once I stitch it together from the right side. But I just thought for transparency purposes, I would share that with you. So I'm going to go ahead and take this to my machine now and edge stitch along it. The instructions actually tell you to baste it from the wrong side and then top stitch it from the right side, but I'm not going to do that again because I just explained this is going to be a casing and there will be a drawstring on the inside of this casing which will gather the fabric up together and hopefully will minimize any imperfections in my center front bodice. Alright, so this is what my finished casing looked like. You can hardly see my stitches, I hope, from the right side. If you can, then you might notice that they're not completely perfect, but I'm just going to roll with the punches for this one. This is what it looks like from the inside. All the edges have been neatly tucked away to the wrong side of my fabric. So since I've finished my casing, the next step is to go ahead and turn 7/8 of an inch along the hemline and along the neckline as well. So that's what I'm going to go about doing next. Alright, so I went ahead and pressed in the 7/8 of an inch right around my hem, stopping just about 3 or so inches short of the center back piece. Now the instructions tell you to baste it in place at this point before joining your center back seams together. But again, I am going to disregard the instructions and I'm actually going to go ahead and join my center back seams together first, and then I'll just do my hem in one fell swoop. Alright, so I went ahead and did my center back seam. I did take time to finish the edges of my seam allowances before I pinned them together at the center back and stitched using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that our seam has been put in, now we can get back to the hem. So I pinned my hem in place after I pressed it up previously, and now I'm going to go along and top stitch it using a 6/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now, the seam itself is 7/8 of an inch, but if I was stitching it from the wrong side, then I would want to stitch it about an eighth of an inch away from the raw edge. So instead, I'm just going to turn it over and I'm going to top stitch my hem in place using a 6/8 of an inch seam allowance. And because I finished off my center back piece, then it means that I can stitch from center front right the way around the hem of my dress right back up to the opposite side of center front. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Right, so the hem has all been done and I did not open my buttonholes before, so I'm going to do it now. I've already got my dress on a cutting mat, so I'm just going to use this buttonhole opener from Clover. This again is also in my Amazon storefront, so if you guys want to go ahead and pick this up, this is my tool of choice for opening buttonholes. So you just want to get it in between your sewn buttonhole and press through to open your buttonhole. And there we have a buttonhole. Be sure when you're doing this bit, not to catch your bodice, like underneath your buttonhole or anything like that, because it will cut your fabric away. So just make sure that it's flat on your surface with nothing behind of it, and then you can go ahead and open your buttonholes. Once that has been done, I'm going to draw for my ties, which are pieces with number 3 on it. I'm going to fold them right side together and stitch them together at my machine using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now it's actually marked on your pattern piece that your ties should be stitched using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Alright, so I've sewn my tie piece, but I did sew it using a 1/4 inch seam allowance instead of a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, just because I would find it a little bit easier to turn when it is slightly wider. Now your instructions don't have you sew across the short end. Instead, it just has you sew along the long end. You turn your tube right side out. Then you have to tuck in your seam allowance and slip stitch your seam allowance closed on one side. I haven't done that. I just went ahead and sewed along the short end and then down the long end. So what I want to do now is to use my pinking shears just to trim down my material along the short end and also along the long end. Usually I prefer to grade my seam allowances, but because This seam allowance is so narrow, and because this is just a tube, then I think I can get away with just trimming down both ends the same. So I'm going to carry this on right the way through up to the top of my tube. All right, so I have one long tube piece, and it's time to turn it right side out. Now, there are lots of different things that you can use to turn your skinny tubes such as this. I know there are lots of like fancy tools out there, and there are loop turners and that sort of thing. And even though I actually own a loop turner, I don't like turning my tubes using the loop turner. I just find it too difficult. Sometimes it becomes unsnapped, all kind of things, and I just don't get good results with a loop turner. So what I'm going to use instead is just this like manicure stick that I had. I think it's called an orange stick or something. This one does have a rounded edge on one side and a more tapered edge on the other side, and I like to use it because it's quite thin and I can get down into my loops. So to turn it out, I like to just tuck in the short ends of my tube onto itself using my stick. I'm just going to push into my loop just like this, and then start pulling it along the stick like so. I'm just going to keep pulling, 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 pull all the way until I get my loop turned to the right side. Now this doesn't take me lots of time. It's not too frustrating. And at the end of the day, I'm left with, oops, one nice long loop. Now I'm not going to go ahead and press my loop. I guess I could. Why am I calling it a loop? Like my drawstring. I guess I could press it, but I don't really want to flatten it in this case. So I'm just going to leave it as is. Now, if my seam allowance was smaller, the downside is I may not have been able to get it pulled through quite this easily. Or if I was using like thicker fabric, sometimes it gives me a little bit more, it takes me a little bit more effort to get it turned through. But this one was nice and easy to turn out. So I'm just going to remove my stick, and I'm sort of just pushing up my seam allowances against the stick just to sort of open them out as much as I can so that I can have the benefit of my wide loop. There we have it, all done. So now I have one raw edge, which is this side, which I'm going to now go ahead and thread through the casing of my dress. Again, this is a stick that I use. I can't even remember where I got it from. It's quite narrow. I did have a smaller one. I just can't find it right now, which I like to use when I use narrower straps. But when I'm using anything about 3/8 inch wide or so, then this one works beautifully. So next step, thread this through the casing in the front bodice. Believe it or not, this is the front of my dress. It looks kind of funny because I did go ahead and thread through one of my loops off camera. So for the loop, I'm going to first put my safety pin. Again, I know there are lots of fancy gadgets for like bodkins or whatever for threading loops through casings, but my safety pin just works fine. And to stop it from opening up, I like to use just a little bit of washi tape, because there's nothing more annoying than when you're trying to pull your elastic or your drawstring or whatever through a casing and your safety pin opens up and the pin gets stuck in your fabric. That can be hell. So I like to just secure my safety pin with a little bit of washi tape, and because it's washi tape, then it's easy to come off once I am done. So I'm going to push my safety pin through the front of my buttonhole, and then once I'm through, I'm going to have to get it through the little gap that I left in my dress when I was doing my hem. All right, I think this side is going to be just a little bit more tricky because I did one side already. All right, so we have it in, and I'm just going to use the safety pin and take my time and push it right the way through my casing, pulling as I go along until I get to the top of my dress. All right, so I've gotten to the top of my casing, and I'm just going to push my safety pin just through the top of my casing that I didn't hem down. And then I'm just removing the washi tape. Can you see how easily that came off? And unpinning my drawstring. Then I'm pushing it into that part of the hemline that I haven't sewn down yet. And then I'm going to pin it into place right here so I don't lose it. Then the instructions tell you, oops, I pinned both sides. Then the instructions tell you to go ahead and stitch right across here to secure your drawstrings. So I'm going to go to my machine now and put a stitch right across my casing at the neckline. All right, so this is what my front dress looks like. My drawstrings are here, and I can gather up my dress and like even out my gathers along the center front seam by just adjusting the drawstrings right here. Now the next step is going to be to finish off these sleeves. So I'm going to go ahead and finish off the edges of my sleeves, and then I'm going to turn in a 7/8 of an inch seam allowance on my sleeves, and then top stitch them again at a 6/8 of an inch seam allowance. All right, folks, so I've done my sleeve hem. I did make a little bit of a mistake. I was meant to sew this using a 6/8 of an inch seam allowance, but I actually sewed it by mistake with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I was just not paying attention to my seam guide, but I didn't want to unpick it because this is a viscose fabric. And you can, if you look really, really close, I don't know if you can see just little bits of white right behind the stitches, and that is where the needle would have pierced this fabric. Even though I did use a very small needle, a 7010 needle, I find that this fabric is difficult to unpick just because it leaves the stitching line, as it were, and I didn't want that for my sleeves, so I just left it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And with that, you guys, this dress is finished. So time to show you what she looks like. I can still shut down the party. I can hang with... There you have it, guys. That was my Sew With Me video featuring McCalls 8413. Be sure to leave me a comment down below and let me know whether you have thought about this pattern before, or whether if seeing this video has sort of inspired you to perhaps giving this pattern a try. Or in fact, whether there are any other patterns that you have come across and quickly dismissed, but later changed your mind and decided to sew up. If you enjoyed this video, please also give me a thumbs up, and if you made it this far, make sure to hit the subscribe icon and turn your notifications on so you never miss any of my upcoming videos. I'll be back with you hopefully on Sunday to share another full bust adjustment tutorial. If you missed the first one, I'm going to put the link in right here. That one featured a wrap front bodice, but Sunday's video will feature a regular dress. No darts, no gathers, no pleatings, nothing of the sort. And I'm going to share with you how to go about making that full bust adjustment and how to remove the dart so that you can maintain the integrity of the pattern. So again, if that's something that you might be interested in, please make sure to subscribe and turn your notification icon on so you don't miss the release of that video. Until next time, you guys, stay calm, stay cool, stay safe, and absolutely keep sewing. Peace.